Hello, welcome to Chapter 7, Audit Evidence. This is ACCA P7, Advanced Audit and Assurance. Okay, let's have a look at the big picture where we always start. Audit evidence is obviously a key element of doing any audit. Without audit evidence and explaining how you arrived at your conclusion, you leave yourself open to criticism of a low quality audit. Now, this is an area that's already been covered in F8, so to a large extent it is assumed knowledge, but clearly it's important to bring yourself up to exam speed again, so you need to go through some basics. Now, it is your use of that basic knowledge which is likely to be different at the P7 stage. What I mean by that is, in F8 you will quite like to be asked what the procedures required were in order to obtain audit evidence. That's F8. That's not enough now for P7. P7, you're going to be more likely to be asked and given a scenario based question where you'll be asked what evidence you would expect to find in your review of the audit working papers. In other words, you're going to be a manager or a partner, whereas before you were perhaps the person providing the information and doing the audit evidence. So you've stepped up a level by doing P7. So when doing a P7 type question, it's important you do not waste time by writing out procedures themselves. That's what you do in F8. What you need to think about for P7 is, well, okay, what stage of the audit am I at, and what am I being asked to consider that work should look like, not necessarily the process of actually doing audit evidence. Key knowledge, financial statement assertions. Well, first thing to think about, what is an assertion? An assertion is a confident and forceful statement of fact or belief. So it's what somebody's said they believe in. So an auditor needs to obtain audit evidence that these assertions, these statements of facts, are reasonable if they are to form an opinion as to whether the financial statements give a true and fair view. And do they comply with the relevant statutory and other obligations in relation to their form and content? So audit evidence is to validate how you've arrived at your decision. How did you get there? What did you do? Because you have to always remember, unfortunately, being an auditor, that you could have your time in court. If you have your time in court, you need to explain how you got to where you got to. You may remember from Enron how Arthur Andersen were taken to court, and 4 years later they were able to validate, even though they'd gone out of business, that their audit evidence was sufficient and appropriate for the conclusion they reached on their last Enron accounts. So they were actually vindicated, even though of course by then, 4 years later, they were out of business. Now, the assertions relating to transactions and events are, you're looking for the occurrence, completeness, the accuracy, cut-off and classification when you're talking about transactions and events. If, however, you're looking at account balances, then you're after a different assertions. You're looking after the existence, your rights and obligations, do you own it, completeness, notice that comes up again, valuation and allocation. So they're not quite the same, and it's important to recognise that there are differences between these assertions, between these different transactions. Assertions related to presentation and disclosure. Oh look, completeness is there again, but this time you've got occurrence and rights and obligations, classification and understandability, accuracy and valuation. So this is definitely something you need to try and remember. And then what you have in exam scenarios, how do you actually, if you think back to what we said earlier, it's important you do not waste time by writing about the procedures themselves. What you're going to be trying to do is think about the process in getting to the assertions here. What audit evidence do you need to verify these types of assertions? You've always got to look to be sufficient and appropriate when considering what appropriate audit evidence you need. So again, something you need to remember from F8, but also is very important for P7. Now the question is, what is sufficient? What does it mean? Well, sufficient will be seen as, in a professional judgment context, it will be influenced by such factors as the nature of the business, the size of the business, and the auditor's past knowledge and experience of that client. So each case will be based upon the facts and scenario that you're faced with to determine what is sufficient. Is it relevant? Well, it'll depend upon the nature of the item being tested and the financial statement assertion being considered. So again, each case, each scenario will be based upon its own facts. Reliable. In most instances, the auditors will base their opinion upon a variety of evidence rather than a single source. A single source is risky because it only could lead to being challenged by something else, and it's then suddenly got one piece of evidence against another. If you can get more than one evidence, then that should help you get to. In considering the comparative reliability of the different forms of evidence, remember this rule we had, I think, from F8. Documentary evidence will be more reliable than oral evidence. Further, client originated and client maintained records is the least reliable. Third party originated but client maintained is the next level. You're going up the tree, so evidence obtained directly from the third party is the best so far of the list we're looking at. However, the best ultimately is auditor generated evidence. You've gone out and got it yourself. So that's the best form of audit evidence that you can get. Audit procedures relating to audit evidence. There are 8 procedures which you need to learn, some combination of which may be adopted by auditors in order to obtain audit evidence. So basically there's a list there, a nice one to learn. It says what it says on the tin if you like, but basically their process of getting your audit evidence on the file and documented, making sure that it's sufficient and appropriate for the case that you're working on. Okay, another list to learn. That's the end of audit evidence. See you in the next recording.